Our next speaker is Professor.Gerrie Snyman from UNISA. He's been editor Old Testament essays, general for a very long time.
I'm at this moment not sure what to do with Jonah and queerness. I'm not sure whether Jonah is queer or whether Yahweh is queer or being queer. What I do know is that both are implicated. Now, imagine a Jew from Auschwitz during World War II being sent to the Nazi headquarters in Berlin or to Hitler's private home in Berghof near Berchtesgaden in Bavaria with a message from the deity that he needs to stop his evil or face the consequences. That's what Jonah had to do. Jew being sent by Yahweh to Nineveh, the arch enemy of Israel, pronouncing judgment over an evil empire. And while we are at imagining, imagine also the confrontation at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when former President H.W. de Klerk made his statement on apartheid and being questioned by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. This point of departure is an ethics of interpretation in line with Schuster Fiorenza's double ethics of reading. I assume a twofold responsibility. Firstly, the reader needs to serve justice to the text in its context by exploring the possible different meanings attributed to the text in the past and present. Secondly, the reader needs to be explicit about his or her own geopolitical context to lay bare the reader's own power relationships and the role the text would play in his or her context. A second point of departure is an ethics of vulnerability, as explained by Aaron Gilson. Gilson differentiates between an epistemology of invulnerability that cultivates ignorance and an ethics of vulnerability. An epistemology of invulnerability is found amongst the powerful elites who occupy positions of privilege and who participate in domination. They are served by values such as detachment, self-containment, self-mastery, and control. An ethics of vulnerability relates to an epistemic vulnerability, which cultivates openness and affectivity. It is an openness to not knowing or to be wrong, yet not prohibitive of interacting in contexts in which one's ideas, beliefs, and feelings are put to the test. Epistemic invulnerability functions in a context where one is unknowing and foreign, a context where one is not in power, yet in a position to learn. Applied to the twofold vulnerability of an ethics of interpretation, I surmise a double vulnerability in the process. A vulnerability on the text side due to its past and current usage, which renders it vulnerable to abuse by the readers, and the vulnerability on the reader's side regarding his or her position towards the possibility of change within the status quo. The reader has a responsibility towards the text, as well is responsible to the text. The reading of the text has consequences, and an ethics of interpretation requires from the reader not only to put his or her methodologies on the table, but also the consequences a reading with these methodologies would have. The hermeneutics of vulnerability implies an epistemic vulnerability, which rejects the closure of the self that runs with invulnerability. So epistemic vulnerability is defined by an openness in the self over against a closure that refrains one from knowing the self. Epistemologically, it means to realize which norms are used to read the text with. Cheryl Anderson refers to the mythic norm of reading the biblical text, a heterosexual, masculine, white, wealthy, middle-class Christian patriarchal reader. But each of these norms has a binary opposing epistemology, which is also implied: decoloniality, black consciousness, black theology, various brands of feminism, critical race theory, constructivism, queer theology. Intersectionality makes it a bit difficult for me to cut my coat exactly to the cloth. As a non-heterosexual, I would not fit the mythic norm, but my masculinity, whiteness, middle class, economic status, and participation in Christianity would make me part of this norm. As part of an ethics of interpretation, I need to put my cards on the table as far as possible and as far as I can recognize them. And even those that I openly admit to, I must reckon with their binary other, but always lurk in the background, and it's not always critically accounted for. So I admit that in as much as Anderson's hidden mythic norm of Bible reading is revealed, the initial reaction of such a reader is of being found out and rendered shameful. It is a pity that it could be thus experienced. But pulling off masks in a masked society is of critical importance to understand the other. And amidst our COVID pandemic, let us smile behind our masks about the irony of it all. The conference task of querying the prophet brings forward the above issues and the reader's own response to positionality regarding the prophet Jonah. I share with him masculinity and the Hebrew parts of Christianity. I'm no prophet, not a Hebrew, and I do not know anything about his ethnicity, education, and economic status. To me, he's more like a cardboard character. He's given a task, he refuses, he does the opposite, he's forced to get in line with his task, does the job, and then retreats in anger to look what happens to the city. I share with him a few of the positionalities, of which two seem important to me. We both are implicated subjects in our different life stories, and we both are somewhere on the continuum of invulnerability and vulnerability. My understanding of queerness is insufficient to queer him, but I wonder if he's not queering the deity in his anger. Let me look at the implicated subject. The unmasking of the mythic norm referred to above is to make explicit the tools we utilize in the reading process. Since these tools are linked up with ideologies, the explication will also reveal our level of implication in our readings of the biblical text. The hermeneutic of vulnerability enables us to confront our own implication. And with implication, I mean what Michael Rothberg means with implicated subject: indirect, structural, and collective agency that enable injury, exploitation, and domination. With implication, it is suggested one is not a direct agent of harm, but nonetheless aligned to power and privilege, and contributing to domination and benefiting from it. An implicated subject does not have a clear-cut role of perpetrator or victim, but nonetheless participates. With this term, I have to get beyond the usually invoked perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. Not being passive bystanders either, their actions or failure to act contribute to the positions of perpetrators and victims. Says Michael Rothberg, modes of implication are complex, multifaceted, and sometimes contradictory, but are nonetheless essential to confront in the pursuit of justice. As with the terms victim and perpetrator, the term implicated subject is not an essence, but an abstraction, or rather an analytical tool. To come to grips with discomforting forms of belonging to a context of injustice that cannot be grasped immediately or directly because they seem to involve spatial, temporal, or social distances or complex causal mechanisms. The term implicated subject relates to the responsibility, but is distinctive from the realm of legal justice that works with guilt and complicity. It does not ignore injustice, but innocence in this sense is developed. Implication is the result of interlocking systems of oppression, resulting into collective political responsibility and the concomitant complex implication of perpetration and victimhood. For the purpose of this exercise, I align my definition of the implicated subject with that of Rothberg, and he in turn aligned himself with Primo Levi's notion of the grey zone. The implicated subject serves as an umbrella term that gathers a range of subject positions that sit uncomfortably in our familiar conceptual space of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. As a reader, the mythic norm would implicate me in certain kinds of oppression at specific intersections and victims at other. Jonah as a prophet would be implicated in the prophecy to the Ninevites. His role in the entire event described in Jonah 3 implicates him in some way or the other. It is this implicatedness that angers him in chapter 1 and 4. In chapter 4, his anger may also be an implication of his querying the deity in asking questions. Queer studies have a latent anti-institutional ethos. It challenges normativity of privilege, especially regarding sex, class, and economy. An overemphasis on one aspect simply disempower a community with regard to the other aspects. A queer hermeneutic will embrace the multiplicities of experience assumed to exist in a narrative representation. Queer hermeneutics imply a lens of multiplicity as to be multiply named, but multiply silenced, and multiply oppressed, and multiply fragmented. Kazanka differentiates between using queer as an identity category and as a politicized sexual identification that expressly rejects heteronormativity. It says the former functions as a catch-all umbrella under which people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual might stand, whereas the latter suggests a potentially narrower frame that has less to do with sexual orientation per se and more with an anti-normative relationship to heterosexuality and its adherent structures such as marriage, monogamy, capitalism, and white supremacy. My concern is aligned with its political nature in terms of its anti-normative and counter-hegemonic perspective. But I also want to add what has become valid criticism of queer criticism, namely the intersectionality of race, gender, sexuality, and other dimensions of difference. In other words, there's a distinctive need to account for the subject positions, the lived experiences of the people who are situated at the intersections of the multiplicity of inequality. No doubt it asks difficult questions around the ethics of interpreting the empirical universe with alternative frameworks, not knowing what the answer will be, just as the book of Jonah ends not really with an answer, and thereby not boosting the reader's confidence. We go to querying Jonah. The story of Jonah comprises of 4 episodes in which Jonah interacts with other characters or groups of people. It starts with an interaction with the deity Yahweh, and then with a group of sailors on a sinking ship. Then the narrative moves to an animal, a fish, that follows Jonah, and which provides a place like a netherworld for Jonah's interaction with the deity. When the fish spits out Jonah, he obeys his calling and engages Nineveh, which with their king answers to the message, upon which Yahweh withdraws his spending punishment. In the 4th act, the deity and Jonah interacts, with Jonah ending up by giving the deity silent treatment. It appears that readings of the book that fail to consider the world of text production and the world of text reception put Jonah at fault. He is accused of nationalism and of turning the Yahweh cult into an exclusivist group. And I have to confess my sin here. In 1984, in my honor and dissertation for my theological degree, I did my mini dissertation on Jonah, and that was the conclusion I came to. But I have to admit, when I wrote that dissertation, it was at the height of apartheid suppression. and I was fully embedded with the stranglehold of whiteness. Ryu refers to the comprehensions like these, which fail to consider the historical context of the book. Such a reader then also fails to see a colonized Jewish author with his audience identified with Jonah's anger and challenging the deity's notion of justice. Ryu is a Korean national, saying he cannot reject Jonah's anger given Korea's subjection by powerful nations. He says as long as the oppression or colonization and its painful memories are ongoing, how can the oppressed hide their anger in learning that their oppressors and colonizers are saved by their God, the God of the oppressed? Ryu argues thus that Jonah's anger can be recognized as legitimate given the power differential between the Israelites and the Ninevites. In my case, 38 years after 1984, now 2022, Ryu's reading makes sense to me and it makes me uncomfortable because I would be judged for the Ninevites' violence and program of colonization. Philippe Junot suggests that elites prefer the tame book of Jonah, a herald of endless divine forgiveness. I was part of that ruling elite. Junot also says that the meta-prophetic character of the book divorces morality from faith. Nineveh is not spared in the end. What Jonah shows is that reading a prophetic book does not entail certainty about the deity or to its predictions. Ryu asks a valid and difficult question to answer. Why does Jonah remain silent in the end? One can argue that Jonah's silence functions as resistance on the part of the weak over against the rhetoric of the strong, which ignores unbalanced power structures in human relationships in the name of universalism. In fact, Ryu argues that it is mostly first world readers with an epistemology of universalism that finds Jonah's silence unproblematic as obedience or as weakness. He regards it as a naive interpretation that do not understand the feelings of colonized people. They do not follow up on the implication of the silence of Jonah. He is accused of particularism or nationalism, either because of their prejudice against the Jews or their privilege as the dominant culture, and because of the fixed theological presumption of God's inclusive love and mercy as the universal truth. The universality of their truth gives preference to inclusivity, drowning the voices of the marginalized and the oppressed. Daniel Timmer offers a few perspectives on the role of the book, what the role of the book can play within a post-colonial or decolonial perspective. The story is situated in the 8th century BCE, but Israel's dealings with the colonial power does not limit the dating of the book to the 8th century. It says Israel's history testifies to numerous occasions on which she was forced to serve the interest of a more powerful entity. For sure, the new Assyrian Empire imposed itself for nearly 300 years in the region, and by the 8th century, there was a marked relationship between Assyria and Israel. At the time of Jeroboam II, according to Timmer, the Assyrian Empire started to decline, enabling the growth of a small-scale kingdom in Palestine, only to be reduced to rubble and Samaria fully absorbed within the larger empire at the end of Solomon's reign. Syria was a brutal and merciless military force that convinced states to become vassals rather than be destroyed, signifying the supremacist ideology between Assyria's domination, which also entailed an overwriting of the identity of those client states, who also became Assyrians. In this view, the audience is also associated with the 8th century. But what if the world of text production and reception is later, 4th or 3rd century? The Jonah of the Book of Jonah is intended to be associated with the prophet referred to in 2 Kings 14, Ehud Ben Zevi suggests as much. The readers had no doubt that the Jonah of the book of Jonah is associated with this Jonah, the son of Amittai, referred to in 2 Kings. Sophia T. Meyer, I think she's here, argues that the connection the reader needed to make was intended by the author. Moreover, the readers would have known that Nineveh was destroyed in 605, and that the mission in the book of Jonah, while not historical, was also not its only and first mission. T. Meyer argues 4 reasons for Jonah absconding his mission. First reason, Jonah knew that what was involved, and by not going, his reputation as a prophet was at risk if the readers did not know that Nineveh was destroyed 100 years later. Indeed, a certain rabbinical text is proclaimed as a false prophet. The second reason, if Jonah knew of Nineveh's eventual downfall, he could have feared the survival of the new Assyrian Empire. In other words, he did not want to go to Nineveh because he could foresee the consequences of Yahweh's change of mind. Third reason, if the book of Jonah was written in the 8th century, Jonah could have feared if Nineveh is not destroyed, Israel would have suffered the wrath of the deity. He rather defended Israel's honor than going to Nineveh. Fourth reason, Jonah turned himself into a martyr on behalf of Israel. He wanted to ensure Israel's survival, and by not going to Nineveh, it would have been destroyed, and Israel would not have endured an Assyrian invasion. With Nineveh wiped off the earth, never to rise again, and the Assyrians long gone, the audience of colonized readers would already have experienced the destruction of Nineveh. Rayu argues that the repentance of the Ninevites would have been received skeptically for the mere fact that Israel suffered a lot under the Assyrian yoke, and they never received notice of such a repentance event or any compensation. They would have labeled Nineveh in the story hypocritical and deceiving. On the other hand, the reader whose mask of colonization has not been ripped off would in all probability give the Ninevites the benefit of the doubt, because colonizers would in all probability also want to forget their own violent colonizing actions. It's a different story when your land has been stolen and plundered and there was no compensation. The lack of restoration of and compensation to Israel problematizes the deity's change of view regarding the Ninevites. With Nineveh's repentance, Israel's fall was implied. Rayu says this was not an issue between Israel is God's chosen people, and foreigners can be included in this chosen. Rather, the issue was God chose Israel as God's people, and God withdraws God's favor of Israel, and instead shows that favor to the enemy of Israel. Nineveh's salvation meant doom to Israel. Moreover, Nineveh's repentance did not entail any punishment, whereas in royal history a king may be pardoned, but he could never avert the punishment. Forgiveness does not make punishments influence. Historically, Nineveh received their comeuppance. Nineveh's repentance bothers Jonah. He feels cheated. But is the pot not calling the kettle black here? Jonah's claim to a Hebrew identity who believes in Yahweh, the creator of sea and earth, is aimed at his Israelite readers of the 8th century. Ethnicity and religion are closely linked when it comes to identity, so much so that Jonah's self-depiction of parents and occupations is peripheral. Timmer sees in him a colonized individual identifying himself first ethnically and then religiously. Jonah may revere Yahweh, but he betrays his calling as a prophet in chapter 1. In chapter 2, with his prayer, his self-depicted faith in Yahweh is unbreakable, despite near complete abandonment by the deity. The Psalms the narrator use are repentant prayers of Israelite exiles, yet no real repentance comes over Jonah's lips. What they do is to contrast him with his enemies who do not revere Yahweh. The deity is on the side of the colonized. It suits the colonized. Yahweh's action in chapter 3 does not suit Jonah in chapter 4. The reader encounters Jonah's anger and discomfort when he spills beans in his previous behavior. He reminds Yahweh of what he said to Moses in Exodus 34, 6-7. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. But here's the problem for Jonah. These life-giving attributes has the opposite effect on him. He prays for death, and these words have no meaning for him. He is opposed to what the deity is doing by showing mercy to his enemy. This credo in itself is problematic. Raheel, for example, asks, is this credo your eulogy or commendation? Is it mocking, or challenging, or complaint of what God did to Nineveh? Jonah feels complicit. It's the only credo in which the deity's love for a foreign country is praised. The other credos he refers to as Israel as the recipient. There's more. Usually a judgment proclamation is given to the people who would become the recipients of that judgment. Judgment against Nineveh is the only judgment that has been given directly to the recipients in a foreign country. While Sprott says it is the best example among the prophetic texts of a purely negative oracle against a foreign nation. All the other judgments about foreign nations were not given to him, but they were intended for Israel's ears, so they could change their ways. When Yahweh makes a decision against people who did not necessarily warn him beforehand, this happened with the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah. Jonah seems to be the only prophet to receive an assignment to confront the foreign nation. Go to my last section. From a general question about the legitimacy of Jonah's anger, God moves to a more particular question. If you look at the rhetoric in chapter 4, namely whether Jonah is angry about the plant that died. The position of power changes. Jonah becomes impetuous and he shows his vulnerability, his anger that has not subsided. He is in his angry mood, not just because of the plant, but because of all the events which had happened to his people and God's treatment of his people and Nineveh. He feels mistreated by the deity and by the rhetoric of the deity driven into a corner. His anger is linked to a plant and not to the painful colonizing history with Nineveh. Thus, he remains silent, not as a sign of obedience, but of resistance. But Yahweh has the last word, never losing his cool. And this does not fit well in the narrative in terms of the proper conclusion. According to Philippe Gillot, all the props, the storm, the fish, the plant, the worm, the sun, and the wind, have served their purpose, as did Jonah and Nineveh. It says, each agent is pitilessly discarded once it has served its purpose. Jonah as the plant becomes irrelevant as soon as he preaches the sermon of doom. Nineveh is likewise redundant after it has chastised Israel. This argument makes sense if one sees in the story a particular determinism, as Jerome puts it. Yahweh dons his robes of fate as the one who determines in advance what takes place in the world and when it happens. For him, the deity is dispassionate, and the assertive reading of Jonah 4 asks from the reader a similar detachment. He does not see a rhetorical question at the end of the book, but an affirmation of God's lack of pity, contrary to Jonah's pity. But reading it as a rhetorical question, as he is going to read it, is to be a remnant of the Christian